Okay, we're going to talk now about the collapse of the Soviet Union. Under the leadership of a man named Mikhail Gorbachev, beginning in the mid 1980s, led the USSR here during that time. Like Deng Xiaoping in China, Gorbachev is committed to really aggressively tackling the country's many problems, such as economic stagnation, kind of the flourishing black market, public apathy, and cynicism about the party itself. His economic program that he launches in 1987 is known as perestroika, okay, or restructuring. This kind of parallels aspects of the Chinese approach by freeing up state enterprise from government regulation, having very small scale private businesses known as cooperatives, kind of being the ideals behind this. He puts on private farming opportunities and cautiously welcomes in things like foreign investment throughout. Culturally, okay, uh, Gorbachev is far beyond the Chinese reforms. His policies, known as glasnost, okay, or openness, permits really an unprecedented range of cultural and intellectual freedoms in the country itself. So in late 1980s, glasnost hits the Soviet Union really like a bomb. You have newspapers, TV exposing social pathologies, crime, prostitution, child abuse, um, suicide, all of these things that existed there that previously had been presented as solely the product of capitalism. So when he goes with this idea behind glasnost, it really opens up the ideas that shows kind of the problems that they had as well. Um, when this happened, when the Soviet history becomes kind of re-examined during this time period, um, and we start to see things like the Bible being brought in, more Bibles and Qurans being widely available throughout this time. This also led to the USSR weakening and collapse. We have things like inflation growing, very little products to actually buy. You'd have things like ration coupons that go out. Um, People fear that there's going to be unemployment. And with little private farming going on, they're wondering how all these things are going to fit and work within their ideals. There's very little in foreign investment taking place as well. We start to see a democracy movement or a movement towards some semblance of democracy, joined by different labor unions. And then we also see nationalist movements coming into play as well. In Eastern Europe, okay, we also see glasnost and competition, kind of competitive elections inspiring what was like a miracle year, okay, of 1989. You have a lot of massive demonstrations, last minute efforts at reform, and the breaching of what was the Berlin Wall. And I'll show you that a photo of that at the next portion of this, or on the next slide. The surfacing of new political groups as well, all coming to kind of power here with this. And the success then emboldens nationalists and even Democrats in the Soviet Union. And if communism becomes overthrown, okay, in the USSR as well, Soviet conservatives and patriots are going to be outraged. To them, Gorbachev is going to stand idly by while political gains that they had from World War II, for which the Soviet Union really had paid in rivers of blood, vanishes all before their eyes here. There's also a military coup that in August of 1991 that triggers the end of the USSR regime. Gorbachev's inability to address any problems may be more of a reason for the collapse than the actual problems itself. Gorbachev just simply could not respond to these ideals, and it leads to that fall. This is the breaching of the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall is a wall that is set up in between East and West Berlin. So after World War II, Germany is going to be split up into zones of occupation. On one side of this, on the eastern side, the USSR has one zone. On the western side of Germany, there are three zones, one for Great Britain, France, and the United States. But Berlin, which was the capital, is also going to be partitioned as well. So on the east side of Berlin, okay, you have the east side of Berlin, you have Soviet ideals, okay, that are there. And on the west side of Berlin, you have more democratic ideals. So the Berlin Wall separates those two. And anybody who might be trying to cross over that would have been shot or killed in some way, shape, or form. In November of 1989, you have anti-communist protesters actually break through the Berlin Wall that divided eastern and western sections of the city. So as East Berlin citizens are entering into the city's western zone itself, that event becomes an iconic symbol of the collapse of communism really in Eastern Europe. And it heralds the reunification of Germany at the end of the war and really the end of the Cold War. And that had divided Europe since the late 1940s at that time. So what happens after communism? Okay. The communist world shrinks. And it shrunk much by the 21st century, and it's effectively dead at that point in time. The great powers continue rivalries, but by 2016, there is a hostile relationship with Russia. Eastward expansion of NATO will exist, and Russia has interventions within Ukraine and Crimea. There's also rivals with the Syrian civil war as well. And Russia begins meddling with United States elections that are taking place. China also has a growing military and economic power that generates tension with the United States and Japan as well. There's instability, okay, within the Middle East. Conflicts between 1948 with the state of Israel and Palestine, which is known as the Israel-Palestinian conflict. Iranian Revolution of 1979 that creates Islamist government there, and it triggers war with Iraq in the 1980s. That becomes a threat to Israel and creates a rivalry with Saudi Arabia as well. You have terrorist attacks by radical Islamist groups, random, unpredictable, generally targeting civilians. We can generate and understand that. Generates fear and insecurity. Obviously, the most significant is September 11th of 2001 with the attack on the World Trade Center, also prompting prolonged wars within that. And we have European, Russian, and Islamic cities also targeted through this time. There are refugees from the Middle East and Africa, many of those that are going to head to Europe. The Syrian civil war generates 12+ million refugees for this time. The US, Russia, and Muslim governments all kind of taking sides. So we have a more regional rivalry that will exist there too. And there's continued conflicts between places like India and Pakistan, North Korea and their neighbors, China and Taiwan. Almost all people have nuclear weapons at this point in time. So there's the global north versus the global south kind of thing. And we see civil wars and separatist movements that are taking shape as well. And military spending rose rapidly in the early 21st century itself. This here is a Middle East around 2000. You can see occupied territory of Israel there in the red. But this is what a lot of this would look like at this point in time. Here we see a Syrian refugee. Among the most wrenching aspects of that are the millions of refugees that it generates throughout this time period here. That is it for our lecture today, gentlemen. Thanks for sticking around, and I will see you all on Friday.